The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going, that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it is already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we going to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up the 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida. While he dismissed the crowd after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but then they saw him walking on the lake. They thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened.
Well, I wonder if I were to ask you this evening what it is in your life or in the world that you are most anxious about this evening. I wonder what that would be. Maybe it's what we were praying about a little bit earlier, all the uncertainty and all the instability in the global sphere, the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and now what seems to be this escalating conflict between Israel and Iran that seems to be threatening to pull in the rest of the world. Or maybe your anxiety is a little bit closer to home. Maybe you're anxious about your studies. You're not sure if you're going to pass your year. Maybe you're not even sure if you're studying the right thing. Is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? Maybe you're anxious about finding work. The job market out there is quite tough. Maybe you're going to have to move. You're going to have to search hard to find anything out there. Maybe, and I suppose this is many of us, you're anxious about relationships. Maybe you're worried you're not going to find that special person with whom you want to spend the rest of your life. You're going to end up alone. You know, if you're anxious this afternoon, and I include myself in that, you know you're in good company. The saints before you have found themselves in a very similar position. I want us to think for a moment about the anxiety that Jesus' disciples must have experienced as they were following him in the first century around Judea, declaring the news that God's kingdom had arrived. Here they left everything behind, all of their economic livelihood, to follow this Galilean preacher. And as he's been growing in popularity, he's also been coming increasingly into conflict with the powers, with the authorities. And at this point that we read about earlier in Mark, He's just sent them out on a potentially very dangerous mission, proclaiming that the long-awaited kingdom of God had at last arrived. And he sent them out, by the way, with very little by way of material provision. You can read about that a little bit earlier in Mark chapter 6. But in between them being sent out on mission and them returning from that mission that we read about in the start of this evening's account, Mark records for us a very interesting incident, reminding us of how John the Baptist, the forerunner of Jesus, had been put to death by Herod Antipas, one of the local rulers, at a great sort of birthday party that he had thrown for all of his leading rulers. And it's just a little reminder of what it might cost you to align yourself with Jesus' mission. This is a tense time for Jesus' disciples. It's clear that his kingdom is coming into conflict with the kingdoms of the world. It's also a very restless time. I wonder if you noticed that Mark, as the disciples return and they report to Jesus everything that they'd done, Mark says this. He said that at this point, verse 31, so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat. They're not eating proper meals. They're probably not getting proper sleep at this point. They had much to be anxious about. What is it that they needed to see at this point? What is it that you and I need to see with our anxieties and our fears and restlessness? Well, Mark would say what they needed to see more than anything else, and what you and I need to see is something more about Jesus, something more about who he is, that he is actually sufficient to bring all of those fears and anxieties to. And as we trace out today's story, I want to highlight just 3 points about Jesus as to why we can rest in him when we are fearful, when we are uncertain about the future. Firstly, because his passion for his people surpasses that of all other leaders. Secondly, because his provision secures and sustains his people. But finally, because his power actually secures them in an uncertain world. So 3 things: his passion, and I think I asked ChatGPT actually to help me alliterate this. It's his passion, his provision, and his power. Let's think firstly that his passion surpasses all other leaders, so we can rest in him. It's interesting that when we're anxious, we often look to strong leaders who look like they have the solution to our problems. Leaders who promise to provide peace, leaders who promise to make the nation great again, to truly provide for the people. But the tragic story of history is that again and again, these leaders end up serving their own interests and maybe the interests of a few elite around them. The first thing Mark wants us to see here in this account is that Jesus is a very different kind of leader. Do you see here what he's done by placing Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 ordinary people out in the wilderness with Herod's sort of great birthday party at which he feeds and at which he entertains all of his ruling men of Galilee? I think he's inviting us to see Jesus as a very different kind of leader to Herod. A leader who's not insecure, a leader who doesn't have to cut down any who seem to be a threat to his leadership, like John the Baptist was to Herod, but a leader who truly serves his people. Did you notice here how attuned Jesus is? Firstly, to the needs of his own disciples. He knows that they just had an exhausting time of ministry, being sent out to proclaim this news. And he says there in verse 31, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." In the original language, it's very emphatic. You yourselves, by yourselves. He's deeply concerned for them about their mental state, about their well-being. But what happens next is perhaps even more surprising. Because, you could say maybe it's not that surprising that a leader is sort of concerned with his inner circle, with those around him. But what happens next is as Jesus sort of sends his disciples out on the boat to the other side of the lake, hoping to get some rest on the other side, the people recognize them. And as we're told, Mark tells us they ran ahead. And by the time Jesus and his disciples arrive there's already a big crowd to greet them. This is the last thing that Jesus and his disciples need right now. They're emotionally exhausted. And here there's a huge crowd in front of them. How is Jesus going to respond to this? Is he going to respond with irritation, frustration? Well, Mark tells us, verse 34, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd already gathered, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Incredible. He responds not with irritation, but with compassion to those whom he doesn't even know, who are not even his close followers. Do you know Jesus' first instinct when he's met with human need is compassion, concern. Jesus sees your need. He sees my need. Who is it that you are looking to meet those deep needs that you have in your heart, those fears? Is it maybe a political party or leader? You think if only they were in power, things would be different. Is it maybe sort of a business leader or a technology leader? You think this person is really going to solve the problems with the world. Is it maybe a boyfriend or girlfriend who you think this person is so strong they can actually make me be who I need to be? Nobody can bear that burden. Jesus is a unique kind of leader. I've served under many leaders in my life, and ultimately they're just human, and you see how concerned they are often for themselves. Jesus is a very different leader. He cares. He really has compassion on his people. So that's the first point. We can rest in Jesus because of his passion for his people. But secondly, he's also a leader who's truly able to provide for his people. His provision sustains his people. It's an incredible picture that Mark gives us here of the crowds gathering around Jesus. What is it that they're hoping for at this point? Some have suggested that what this crowd were hoping for was something of a revolution, that Jesus might take up the role of a political liberator and set them free from the oppressive rule of the Romans. And there may be a few details in the text that might suggest this. Firstly, I wonder if you noticed the location. A few times it's mentioned that this is a desert place or a wilderness place, literally. Historically, many Jewish movements of revolution had begun in the wilderness. The Maccabean movement, a century or two earlier, had done that. Secondly, you hear the fact that Mark emphasizes particularly the men who were present. We don't actually know if there were women and children, but there were 5,000 men there. That's a small army. That's a legion of soldiers. Thirdly, the fact that Mark draws attention to how the people are grouped into hundreds and fifties, maybe sort of recalling Israel's sort of military divisions of captains of hundreds and fifties. But finally, there's an interesting detail in verse 45 that afterwards, in the original, it's quite strong language. Jesus sort of compels his disciples to get into the boat. There's an urgent sort of situation going on here. If you read the parallel account in John chapter 6, John actually tells us that at this point, the people wanted to come and make Jesus king by force. So there's something to be said here. Perhaps that's what the people were hoping for. Sort of Jesus rising up as a military leader. But whatever the crowd's expectation, did you notice how Jesus responds to them? The first thing he does as they come crowding to him, he has compassion on them. So what did he do? He began teaching them many things. And no doubt teaching them about the kingdom of God, about the nature of God's kingdom, how that kingdom comes in the world. Here is a leader who knows that what you and I need more than anything else is to know God, to know God's purposes, to know God's ways. What is wrong with the world is that we've abandoned God. But Jesus is also very aware of the real material needs of people. And so as the day draws to a close, his disciples, who are maybe fearful here, that as this huge crowd gets increasingly hungry, that things might start to turn ugly, they come to Jesus and they urge Jesus, let these people go so that they find something to eat in the surrounding villages. But you notice Jesus wants to meet their needs himself. And so he actually puts it back on the disciples in verse 37. He says, you give them something to eat. What would you do if you were confronted with that situation? Have you ever had that responsibility before? You feed these 5,000 people in the wilderness. That would make you begin to pray, I think. And they can hardly believe it. You know, that would take more than half a year's wages, the disciples respond. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give them to eat? You know, is this really the best use of our resources, Jesus, to try to feed these people? I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you know that the resources you have just simply cannot meet the needs. You're just unable to meet a need in front of you. That's quite a paralyzing situation. But Jesus, did you notice, quickly takes charge of the situation. He finds out what resources they do have. 5 small loaves would probably only be enough for one man, really, each loaf. 2 fish. He directs the people to sit down on the grass in groups. He gives thanks. He breaks the bread and he begins to distribute it. And it begins to go out, and it just keeps on multiplying and just keeps on going out more and more people are just eating. It never runs out. You know, it's very clear here that Mark wants us to understand that, you know, this is not sort of each person just eating a tiny little bit and somehow being satisfied. That the real miracle was that people were satisfied with so little. Some have suggested that. You know, neither is this simply the fact that one person began to share a little bit and that sort of spontaneously made other people sort of begin to share. And so, you know, everybody in the end was satisfied. No, Mark is very clear here that this is an astounding miracle of provision. Each person ate, he tells us, and they had their full, so much to the extent that 12 large basketfuls, far more than they originally had to start with. That's what they ended with. This is an incredible miracle of provision. But you know, the point here is not simply that Jesus is able to provide. It's actually what the context actually tells us about who this is telling us that he is in this particular context. You know, who else, against all the odds, provided food for his people in the wilderness? Who else taught his people in the wilderness that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God? And what is Jesus doing here when he sees the people as sheep without a shepherd? And he begins to teach them, and he begins to feed them. You know, for those who have eyes to see, this is Jesus demonstrating, I am the God who provided for the manna from heaven for our people in the wilderness. I am the good shepherd who was promised, the one who leads his people beside quiet waters, the one who refreshes their souls. You know, have you seen that this is who Jesus is, that he is the Lord, that he is the shepherd king, that he's able to provide in your situation, even where it seems perhaps impossible. There seems to be no way that your needs can be met in the situation. Have you seen that about Jesus? He is the one who provides, who sustains his people. But finally, I want us to think about how his power also brings true security in an insecure world. And here I want us to reflect about what happened later that night, after this incredible miracle, as Jesus puts his disciples on the boat and tells them to cross over back to the other side. Because what happens is a very strong sort of wind comes up, and the disciples, just as they are out there on the boat on their own, just don't seem to be able to make any progress. And I think we're meant to get a little picture here of God's people being unable to actually achieve anything, to reach any kind of goal or accomplish anything apart from Jesus' presence. Mark emphasizes here for us that Jesus is not present. Jesus has gone up on his own on the mountainside to pray. I think another indication that this is a very important turning point in his ministry. But Jesus up there alone on the mountain, they're alone in the middle of the sea. And we're told that Jesus actually from that vantage point on the mountain sort of looks down later that night. And he looks down and he sees there the disciples straining at the oars, being driven back. And you know what literally the word that Mark literally uses? in the original language is he literally says that they were tormented at the oars, or they were tormented as they were rowing. It's a very strong word. You know, it's the same word that he had used in the previous chapter, where the demon actually, when he encounters Jesus, cries out, "Do not torment me." So these disciples here are tormented. It's a desperate picture. And remember, these are skilled fishermen. These are hardened fishermen, but they are just unable to make any progress. They're driven back by a force far too strong for them. And this has been going on for a long time. Mark tells us that it's the fourth watch of the night, and that the Romans divided the night up into various watches. This is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. These disciples have been at it, but they've been able to make no progress all night. And it's at this point that Jesus comes out to them, walking on the sea. You know, another incredible miracle. Some have tried to suggest that, you know, this is maybe just Jesus walking on a sandbank. No, Mark, it's very clear that's not Mark's intention here. He tells us that they're out in the middle of the sea. Clearly, this is something incredible that is happening here. And then we have this strange language. I wonder if you've noticed it before, that Jesus was intending, or Jesus was about to pass by them. What do we make of that? He was about to pass by them. Wasn't he coming to them? Some have suggested that the language here is sort of parallel to the language in the Exodus, where God's presence sort of passes by Moses. But you know, another possibility is that Mark is telling the story from the perspective of the disciples in the boat, to whom it looked like Jesus was about to pass by them. And they're terrified here by the sight. They think he's a ghost, and they cry out. I think another indication that this is clearly something supernatural going on here. What is it? Here's the one who's coming to rescue them, but his presence actually creates even more fear because they don't recognize him. Well, I suppose in some ways their response is a very natural human response. You know that people can't walk on water. It goes against all human experience. And these men were Jews. They also knew their scriptures. They knew something maybe like Job chapter 9 and verse 8. Speaking of God at creation, it says this: "He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea." Or maybe they remembered Psalm 77, verse 19, a psalm that remembers how God had dried up the sea during the Exodus. "Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." So the kind of raw power and control over the nature that would be necessary to walk over water, these men know that kind of power belongs to God alone. And so they're terrified at this point. What is it that they need to hear at this point to set them free from that fear? Not only that God is somehow there in the storm, not only that God is powerful, but that God is actually for them, that He is their God. And did you notice here how Jesus announces Himself? He announces Himself here with the covenant name of God, the name that God had revealed to Moses at the time of the Exodus. "I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I'm your God." How does Jesus announce Himself to them in verse 50? Immediately He spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I." Literally in the Greek, ego eimi, I am. Take courage, I am. Don't be afraid. Then He climbed into the boat with them, Mark tells us, and the wind died down. Jesus' presence brings peace in that tumultuous situation. He brings rest. What does that mean, finally, for you and me this afternoon with our anxieties, with our fears? I think we're often like the disciples. It's interesting how Mark ends this account. They were amazed, Mark tells us. Even though they'd just seen the feeding of the 5,000, as the wind died down, again they were amazed. Why? Verse 52, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Quite a sad picture, actually, having just witnessed such incredible provision from the Lord, but still blind to his presence. Is that not so often true of us as well? How often has the Lord provided for you in your situation, in your desperate need? And yet again, you find yourself just paralyzed by fear again. How often is the Lord actually present with you, but actually only in hindsight do you see it? You know, that is often true in our lives. And I think there's an important lesson here to realize that the Lord is always mysteriously present, maybe especially present in those darkest situations. He's always at work. And that's what the disciples needed to see. That's what they needed to know. And how is it this afternoon, this evening, that you and I can know that the Lord is always present, even in our darkest situations, even when, as David says in Psalm 23, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Well, once again, I think we need to see Jesus' ultimate provision for us. Not only a meal that feeds us for a day, but the true sustenance that our souls need, the ultimate provision, a restored relationship with God, forgiveness. You know, this meal that Jesus presides over here, I think Mark so clearly wants us to look forward to a later meal where Jesus again took the bread and he again broke it the night before his death. And he said, "This is my body given for you." And when he took the cup and said, "This is my blood shed for you, for the forgiveness of your sins." That is what our souls most need. Have you seen that? Have you seen that Jesus has done that for you? That ultimate provision. How can you not trust him with your fears and anxieties when you've seen that he's given his life for you? And that is what we most need. You know, I used the word earlier that Jesus is passionate for his people. Do you know what that word means? We often use it. You know, I'm passionate about cricket or something. You know, passion, actually, that the root word means to suffer. If you're passionate about something, you're going to suffer for it because it's important to you. Have you seen how passionate Jesus is about you, that he suffered for you? He gave his life for you. Are you willing to trust him with your fears and anxieties? Have you brought those to him? Have you seen his power as the great I am, as the covenant-making and the covenant-keeping God, that he's able to provide for you even in those desperate situations? I need to keep on hearing that message myself. And I know that as followers of Jesus, we all need to hear that.